Okay, shall we start? So where we left off was that yesterday I had talked about resonance as an underlying unifying theme in Oriental medicine, and what I was trying to do with that talk, I had two purposes. One was to try to explain Chinese thinking in a way that encompasses the material aspects of reality, but in a second to show how there is a linkage between that the resonance concept and the opening it leaves for a connection to the non-physical aspect of reality, which is where we're getting into the Shen disturbances. So I used Huainanzi as the classical text yesterday to talk about resonance theory. In today's talk, I'm going to try to use excerpts from the Nanjing and the Ling Shu to connect my discussion on possession into the story. So let's look at the next slide. And this is from Paul Unschold's translation of chapter 5 of the Nanjing. And I'll just read it out. So it's the fifth difficulty, which is the movement in the vessels may be either light or heavy. What does that mean? And the answer is, it's like this. First, one touches the vessel at the inch opening by exerting pressure as heavy as 3 beans, and one will reach the lung section, which is at the level of the skin in its hair. Then if one exerts a pressure as heavy as 6 beans, one will reach the heart section, which is the level of the blood vessels. And as heavy as 9 beans is the spleen section, which relates to the flesh. And if you go all the way down, if you go to 12 beans, you'll get to the muscle level. And if you go all the way down to the bone and then come back a little bit, you get to the kidney level, which again connects to the bones. And these are described as light and heavy. So I actually recently was involved in an online argument, if you will, about what the Nanjing actually says there. Because in my practice, I use this chapter very much. This is highly significant for me in post-diagnosis section of the classics. And I tend to think of it as the different levels which are being alluded to here, the skin level and the muscle level and the bone level, etc. But I was challenged by someone online that the Nanjing doesn't actually talk about levels, it talks about these beings. And I think you can even see that level here is put in parentheses, which is, I think, indicating this is the translator's interpretation of what must be being spoken about, but that's just his opinion. It's not actually in the text. And the point that this challenger was making is that the text actually is talking about pressure or weight, actually the weight of different number of beings, and that this was really about the force that you use when you're palpating, how much pressure or force you put your finger at. Personally, I think that's quibbling, but the reason that I mention that is there's some possibility that there's a further meaning hidden in this passage which relates to the movements of yin and yang, depending on, with the idea that yin and yang, as we know, go through this sinusoidal alternation of growing, reaching a peak, diminishing, and reaching a nadir, and constantly going up and down. In the same way with the circulation of Wei Qi and Ying Qi go through these alternating phases. And there's some possibility that this particular chapter is alluding to the amount of pressure you use meets the amount of rising or falling pressure that these various forms of qi are at that moment, and that they keep changing. So I just want to leave that as a mystery for further exploration in the future, that there may be more in this chapter than I'm able to talk about at this point. But clearly what we see is that all the classical associations of the organs, the Zhang organs in the body, go from the superficial level is the lung, and they actually correspond to, in our physical body, where these organs are located. The physical organs are actually located. The lung is the canopy at the top, and it also, so it's the lightest pressure on the pulse corresponds to the lung, and it also corresponds to the skin, which is the most superficial tissue in the body. And as we go down sequentially, we get to the heart level, which corresponds to the blood vessels, which are not that much deeper than the skin level. And then we get to the spleen, which is always the center. The spleen, the earth element, is always in the center of everything and corresponds to the flesh. And further down is the sinew level, or muscle, you can call it the tendinomuscular level, which corresponds to the liver. And deepest of all is the bone level, which is the deepest level of the kidney, housing our deepest resources of the jinn, which we're going to talk about. So for me, this is not only a wonderfully practical guiding chapter, but it's also a very clear example of how resonance theory is being exemplified here with the physical location of the organ, the physical location of the tissue, and the energetic elements. So these are going from metal to fire to earth to wood to water. And so if you want to check in with what's going on in the pulse at any given position of your fingers, where your finger feels the most impulse, the strongest, clearest impulse, is where the movement of the 5 phases is happening in that position. So ideally, we would like that movement to be at the correct location for that element. So if we're talking about the left wrist, and we're talking about the sun position, where we're supposed to be feeling the heart and small intestine, we would like it to be at the second depth, right, where the relating to the heart and the vessels. That should be where you feel the strongest, clearest impulse. If instead you're feeling the clearest impulse when you're all the way down at the bone level, what you're feeling is the movement of water in the heart sector, in the fire sector. And that's a clear sign of imbalance between fire and water. So this is a very important chapter in the Nanjing that is important. I want to make sure you clearly get that, because it's going to be how I'm going to tell you the way to diagnose possession. So if you don't get this, the rest of it won't make sense. Okay, next.
Sorry, could you just say that very last section again, and just moving down?
Okay.
Section about fire and water. I should come kind of coming down to the pulse.
Right, so the sequence as you're going down in the pulses, actually, go to the next, okay, so this is actually an easier way to see it visually. At the lightest pressure of 3 beats is the lung correspondence, but as we know, lung is the metal element. Deeper, next one down deeper is the fire element of the heart. Next one deeper is the earth element of the spleen, wood element of the liver, and water element of the kidney. So if you, let's take another example. If I'm going to go at the guan position on the left wrist, what element corresponds to the guan position? Wood, right? Everybody agree? Any disagreements? Okay, so where should the pulse be most distinct? At what level?
Clarify which position of pulse you go to. Can you clarify which position you're talking about?
Left wrist is the second middle position over the styloid process for most pulse diagnosticians. So it's this so it should be, you should feel the pulse widest here or clearest here. But if you feel it clearest right at the surface, which surprisingly is not all that uncommon, what that means is that there's an imbalance between the metal and the wood element. And I'm not going to distinguish between the tongue and Fu organs. It's not necessarily the liver or the gallbladder, it's the wood element. And the metal is not necessarily the lung or the large intestine. It could be either of them. It's the element or movement. Okay? Okay, next slide. So as I mentioned before, people that take pulses don't always do it the same way. They don't put their fingers in the same place. And what I'm going to teach you now is my own personal interpretation and also my own personal discovery. So I don't want anybody to take this as dogma, representing anything that is authoritative Chinese medicine. I personally find it extremely useful in clinical practice, and it's what I came to after 35 or more years of practicing acupuncture and trying to make sense out of pulse diagnosis. So I'm happy to share it with you as long as you realize that this is my speculations, and I go into it in more depth in a recent book that I put out if you're interested in that. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. What I'm basically, my theory is that there are two basic positions in radial pulse diagnosis in Chinese medicine. There are actually a lot many more positions that are used by other schools of Oriental medicine, much more proximally placed up the wrist, and in Ayurvedic medicine, proximally placed up the wrist. But now we're just going to talk about Chinese medicine. There are two basic positions. So one of them I'm going to call the yang position, which is the position where the left, where it could be, this picture is showing the left wrist, so we're going to talk about on the left hand, but it's exactly symmetrical on the right hand, where the middle finger is placed right over the styloid process of the radius. So if you examine your styloid process, it unfortunately isn't a point. You know, it's not shaped like a metallic bar that has a exactly distinct point. But if you're careful and feel very, take a little bit of time, you can feel the apex where the peak of the styloid process is. And that's exactly where, if you put your middle finger over that position, you're in picking the correct place to do the yang, to evaluate the yang aspect of all 12, well, on each wrist there will be 6 of all 6 officials or organ systems. And the index finger is going to slide in right under the wrist, the last of the wrist bones. And almost always, for most people, that's going to be exactly connected to where your middle finger is. If you have somebody who's really a giant, your fingers are going to be spread out a little bit. And if you have an infant or a child, you're going to have to squeeze your fingers together so that you can't put your full fingertip down. But for all practical purposes in clinical practice, I rarely have to make any of those adjustments because proportionately with the rest of the person's body, those distinctions are minuscule. So the rest of this is quite standard. First position, which is the most distal position, is heart and small intestine, but it's reflecting the yang. So you understand that the heart is a yin organ, but there's heart yang and there's heart yin. So every organ has both a yang and a yin aspect. And what I'm talking about is the yang aspect of each of those functions, so that using whatever you have already been taught, you are able to get information about all of the organs, even if you just use the regular finger position like this that you probably were taught without going to the next one that I'm going to show you. It's just that will give you a different kind of information, but you're still getting information about all the officials at those 12 standard places. Okay, the next slide shows what I'm calling the yin positioning of the pulses. And all it is you're moving your fingers approximately about an inch. And in this way, what you're doing is finding that same apex of the styloid process, but instead of centering your middle finger on it, you're using that to divide your index and middle fingers' positions. Okay, so you're just moving your 3 fingers closer to the trunk of the body by approximately half a cent. And this reflects, in my experience, the yin aspect of the functioning of the 12 officials. I think that it's still something I'm playing with, and I think that there's some case to be made for, I'm still looking at, whether you can actually get more information about the small intestine functions from the yang positioning and more information about the heart's functioning from the yin position, for instance. But, and the reason for that is yin organs predominantly carry yin energy. Yang organs predominantly carry yang energy. So we get more information about them by taking the pulse in their preferred position. And actually, there's a really excellent book in English by Radha Tambaraja. I forget the name of it. It's something like 5-element energetic acupuncture, something like that. You can look up her name and find it. She's a Ceylonese practitioner who trained in China during the Cultural Revolution, and she was actually taught a lot of the material that's similar to what Worsley teaches, and like with the energy transfers along the Shonin co-cycles, a little bit different description of how that happens, but basically the same kind of information. And she very much makes a point about the different proportions of yin and yang energy in each of the meridian systems, which is very similar to what I'm trying to say here about which finger position it's better to use if you want information about how that organ is functioning or official is functioning. Okay, next slide. Okay, I've already covered that. Next slide. Okay, so this is one of the people that I've studied with, Joseph Adams, was the one who helped me to recognize the importance of the fifth difficulty in the Nanjing. And this is his diagram. So let me help orient you to the way he illustrates pulses. When he takes pulses, he has his patient sitting, and so he's facing them, and he takes both pulses at the same time. So if you imagine you're sitting facing your patient, how is this going to work? It's actually from the other position. In any case, this is the left wrist, which shows water, wood, and fire, and this is the right wrist, which shows earth, metal, and right fire, minister fire. And it's basically just going over what I explained before as the Nanjing's description about the correct depth. So the correct depth for the metal pulse is superficial, the least amount of beams of pressure. Correct depth for the fire pulse is the next one down. The correct depth for the earth pulse is the next one down. The correct depth for the wood pulse, the next one down. And finally, for the water pulse is the next one down. The only one that's controversial is, according to Adams, he sees as modern TCM teaches, and actually it's been taught in Chinese medicine for quite a long time, that the pulse in this position is actually a part of the kidney, whether it's kidney yang or kidney yin, people disagree about. But the Worsley school teaches that as a fire pulse, as a circulation sex pulse and triple heater pulse. And so someone might think that if it's fire, you should feel the pulse when they're healthy up in this position. The answer is no. Clinically, I'm quite sure from my experience that when people are healthy, their pulse on the right side should be at this depth, but it's not the water element that it's reflecting. And again, this is a whole nother lecture, which is what is ministerial fire all about, because it clearly has relationships to both the fire and the water element. And for me, the easiest way to understand that is that anatomic, again, this has that resonance to the anatomy of the body that we talked about, from the lung being at the top, going all the way down to the kidneys. So what else that relates to fire is down at that level in the physical body? Is Mingmen, right? Mingmen is associated with the fire, the kidney yang's fire of life. And so I think that's the way I like to think of why the pulse in this position should, when you're healthy, be at the deepest level, is it's showing you the state of Mingmen. Okay, next slide. So this is just an illustration of what was asked a few minutes ago. If I could go over it again, is the matrix for the depths. These are the healthy. This is in a healthy individual. This is what it looks like, more or less. If you feel the pulse, it's clearest and widest and strongest for the kidney at the deepest level. And then you can feel it at all the levels, but you should feel this gradual increasing awareness of it until you get at the deepest level. Whereas for something like the liver, it will get stronger as you go deeper, but then once you pass the fourth level down, it starts getting weaker again. Okay? And again, in the right hand, what I call third position, it should feel exactly like it does in the left hand third position. It's just that the meaning is different. Okay, next slide. So this is what happens if you feel somebody's pulse that's out of balance. This is if you're in the left hand, third position, which is where you should feel the kidney energy. So it's the drip position on the left hand. You should feel the widest pulse down here, but it's not unusual to feel it up here at the fire depth, which is the way Adams was saying that's what is supposed to happen if it's a fire, if it's really reflecting a fire element in that location. Actually, when it's doing that, it means there's something wrong, there's something pathological. So next slide is what you want to do is, in your treatment, transform this observation into this observation. If you get that, then you know you've done a good treatment. Next slide. Okay, so what I've observed in my clinical practice is one of the most common findings is that you will experience two places in pulse diagnosis where your fingers are finding that strongest impulse out of where it belongs. And usually they resonate with each other. So a good example would be you're taking a pulse where the liver's pulse is supposed to show up, and it's strongest at the superficial level, which is the metal position. And then you go to the, so that's on the left hand, and you go to the right hand, and you take the pulses, and this could be either the yin or the yang position of taking the pulses, as I explained before. So the people that are trained in always doing pulse diagnosis with your finger centered on the your middle finger centered on the styloid process are going to miss half of these presentations. So you need to be able to do both of them to pick this up. But
should both in both the yin and yang position that be on the same level?
no, it could be only on, and most often is only on one of them. And that's why I'm saying it's important to do both, because if you only do one, you'll miss half of the times that where the imbalance is actually showing up. So on the right hand, in the index finger's position, which is the tsung position, the depth where you feel it is going to be at the wood level, which is almost all the way down, 4/5 of the way down to the bone. So the wood, the metal position is reflecting wood, and the wood position is reflecting metal. Very common clinical finding, which is basically telling you that wood and metal are out of balance with each other. And there are lots of strategies clinically for treating that, for how you deal with that. And I don't want to spend time on that because we'll run out of time for getting into depossession. And if there's time later, I can try to address that a little bit. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to give you a couple of cases from my own practice. First one is a 35-year-old woman who came to me for prolonged and severe depression. It had started when she was 15 years old, when her parents got divorced, and she had been treated with every known antidepressant medication at the time, none of which helped her at all. They all made her feel worse, except for Adderall, which is a stimulant. It's in Benzedrine, like caffeine family of medications that actually helped her to focus her mind, and it didn't make her feel normal, but at least she was able to function a little bit better. And her chief complaint was very simple. It was, I asked her, why are you coming? She said, I'm depressed. I said, well, what do you mean by depressed? I want to die. And when I heard that, immediately my heart sank, I have to tell you, because I guess I had a feeling like somebody that's that upset by life is probably not going to be easy to treat. But as long as life is present, it's still possible to help restore normality. And in taking her history, the other things that I came up with was that she had had asthma since childhood and that she also had polycystic kidney disease. Next slide. So I happen to have diagnosed her as having a water constitution, water CF, with deficiency of kidney yang, which would explain a lot about her clinical history. It would explain why stimulants, which stimulate kidney yang, would make her feel better. And kidney yang is responsible for grasping the qi. So if she had a problem with that, it would explain her asthma, and also why she had developed polycystic kidney disease, where her kidney yang was insufficient. So that was my clinical diagnosis of her constitution and her general medical history. But when I took her pulses, all of her yang position pulses, so that means this is the normal place that most people take pulses, they all were widest at the deepest level, just above the bone. Now, very unusual, because almost always most of the pulses are in their correct place, and you might find one or two, occasionally a few more that are out, but it's very rare to find all of them out. And this was the first time I had ever, I'm sorry, they were at the earth level, not at the water level. They're all at the middle level. Very unusual to find all of the pulses displaced into the same level, away from where they're supposed to be. And so connecting what was obviously a Shen disturbance, I want to die, with a clearly very unusual pulse presentation, it occurred to me, here's an ideal candidate for doing a depossession treatment. And so I treated her with, as Worsley teaches, when you have somebody who has an emotionally caused Shen disturbance, if they're possessed by internal demons, we use the internal dragon protocol, which I'll go over later with you, which is what I did. I put in, there were 7 points, I put them in and let them, I sedated them, let them stay in place. And lo and behold, after I took the needles out, all of her pulses in the yang position had returned to the normal depth, and which to me was astonishing. You know, so it wasn't subtle at all. This was dramatic, from everything locked into the middle level to everything going back to where it was supposed to be. It's like, you know, a seesaw that's perfectly horizontal to a seesaw that's, you know, you look at it and there's no doubt in your mind that that's the way it's supposed to be. And what she said when she returned to her next visit was, I feel happy, I'm like my old self again. And again, that's, you know, one of the golden keys that I learned in my training was when somebody says, I feel like, it's not that I'm happy, it's that when they say, I feel like my old self again, you know that you've touched them on a very deep level, that you've, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the CF, but you've reached where they need to move, where they're stuck. So this got implanted in my mind that, oh, wow, I bet that's the physiological correlate for, or the diagnostic correlate for people who need the internal dragons. And it's been my experience that that's reliable. When I feel that in the pulse and I do the internal dragons protocol, pulses go back to where they're supposed to be, people feel better. Okay, next slide. So this is what it looked like originally with her. Everything was at that middle level, corresponding to the earth. Next slide. And this is what it looked like afterwards, the treatment, when everything, forget this, everything went back to where it was supposed to be. Okay, next slide. So this is the other case. I had a 70-year-old woman. Both of you, I'm still in contact. This woman I still treat. The first woman, I'm still in contact with. I spoke to her about a month ago. She's moved out of the Bay Area where I live to about an hour and a half away, so I don't see her very often, but she's doing great. She's doing fine. So this was a 70-year-old woman whom I've been treating for at least 10 years, and she had a million different complaints. Allergies, herpes simplex, diverticulitis, bursitis, low back pain, sciatica, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, coronary artery disease, arthritis. But the most striking thing about her was how anxious she was, and her manner was propulsive speech. I couldn't shut her up. It was just, it took incredible patience for me to be with her long enough to get her up on the treatment table. And she had a history of multiple physical injuries, automobile accidents, whiplashes, falls, operations. And that recently, before this particular visit, she had overstrained herself moving to a different home. And I had held her as a wood CF with a gallbladder deficiency as her main problem. Actually, I now have changed my opinion about that, although that's what's written, and if you read about this case in my book, that's what you'll find. I've now changed to, I think she's a small intestine excess constitution, and it's a good example of what I talked about yesterday with the Sheng cycle, Shang Sheng. The meaning of Shang is mutual. It's not cycle. It means it goes both ways. And what's the relationship between the gallbladder and the small intestine? They're mother-son related, and we're used to thinking of the gallbladder feeds the small intestine, and it doesn't go both ways. But in actuality, I helped her a lot by treating the gallbladder, even though I've now been able to help her even more by treating the small intestine as her constitutional diagnosis. So I'm just sticking that in as an extra. It doesn't really relate to why I'm presenting this case, but it's nice to be able to follow up with what I said yesterday. So this is her presentation at the time. Next slide was on this particular visit. What I noticed, which was unusual for her, was that all of her pulses were at that deep level, right over the bone level, instead of being at their correct depth. And therefore, and as I alluded to, she had had multiple physical problems coming from the outside, whether it was whiplash injuries or surgeries or other things from outside that had disturbed her. And according to the Worsley understanding and teachings, things from the outside are external devils, and so it's better to use the external dragon protocol, which are 7 different points that I'm going to go over. So I put those points in, and in this case I tonified the points rather than sedated them, and I'll try to get to the reasoning for both of those today. So tonification treatment is very quick. You put the needles in, and stimulate them, and take them out. As soon as I took the needles out, she popped up. Well, first of all her pulses amazingly went back to their correct depth again, which made a big impression on me. She popped up and said, "My back stopped hurting. What did you do to me?" And this is a woman that never says stuff like that. She often will say, "Well, it takes me a couple of days before I really recognize, what effect treatment has had on me. I don't usually feel it right away." And so this was quite unusual. And again, it kind of alerted to me to how powerful this particular treatment was for her. Okay, next slide is again showing all her pulses before treatment at this deepest level. Again, in the yang position, not the yin position. Next slide. And this is afterwards, again, disregarding the right-sided third position. It should be at the deep level. And let me add that in the yin position pulses, just moving your fingers a half a sun proximally, none of this was obvious. All of the pulses were at the correct depth at the yin level, which is really interesting to me that just making that very slight difference in location, you get totally different readings. And those readings were normal. So again, what does that suggest to you if her yang pulses were misbehaving, indicating abnormality, but her yin pulses were indicating things were okay? Anybody want to hazard a guess?
External influences. How do you reach an internal, really internal depth? Yes. The young organs?
There you go, yang organs. That the yang organs were asking for treatment, basically. Okay? And what we're going to see is that the protocols for both the internal and the external dragons are essentially points of the yang meridians. And that's why it shows up in the yang position pulses and not in the yin position pulses. Okay, next slide. So to completely explain what I'm doing in this pulse analysis and treatment, there's a lot of stuff that comes from different traditions, from Ayurvedic medicine, Ayurvedic pulse diagnosis, and from Korean hand acupuncture theory that I may or may not be able to get to today, but I'll do my best. Okay, let's go to the next one. So those are just examples of what internal and external possession look like, and we'll get to the protocols for treating them. But what are Shen disturbances, and what do the classics say about it? Are you going to tell me when I'm about halfway through, or are we past that already? 14 minutes? 40. I have 40 minutes left? Okay. Okay, so next slide. So Lao Tzu says the spirits come from heaven and consent to remain within a man only if his heart is serene and empty as heaven itself. The reason I included this is it's kind of just trying to connect what I'm saying today to what I said yesterday, that an empty heart is the essence of the proper functioning of the Shen. And whatever that may mean, it's an important concept to keep in mind. Next slide. And yesterday I talked about Huainanzi chapter 6. This is the next chapter, right after chapter 6, which talks about resonance, Ganying. This is the chapter about Jingshen, which talks about spirit and essence. And what it says is, therefore, this is from Elizabeth Rochat's translation, therefore the vital spirits, Jingshen, belong to heaven. Now, Huainanzi is assigning both Jing and Shen in this to heaven. Next slide. Whereas the bony framework belongs to earth. So the physical body, again, in Huainanzi, is being looked at as earth. And so the reason I'm showing this is when using any of the images in Oriental medicine, all context is everything. So in the context of the Jingshen versus the physical body, yes, Jingshen, both Jing and Shen are heavenly, and the physical body is earthly. But if you limit the context to Jing and Shen, then it changes. Then the Shen is heavenly and the Jing is earthly. So always keep context in mind. Next slide. Okay, here we go to the Ling Shu, which is part of the Neijing. And what it says is that in chapter 8 is the coming forth of living beings indicates the essences. Essences are the reproductive essences from the father and the mother. And the embrace of these two essences indicates the spirits. It's not quite clear what indicates means. And for me, this has always been and remains a central puzzle as to what is our nature as human beings. How much of who we are is determined by our genetics, and how much of who we are is coming to us from this non-material realm. I mean, our genetics is coming through our DNA and maybe through our mitochondrial DNA and other aspects that we get from our gametes from our parents. But it's, we get some kind of material input there. But is there not some other aspect of who we are that isn't just simply what we get from our parents? Because we all know that, we're not clones of our parents, that we're all unique individuals. There's never been anyone else like us, and there never again will be exactly like us. So where does this part that makes us individual come from if it's not in our genes? But there is also something that is in our genes that is very concrete, if you will, and enables us to be classifiable as different types. We have predispositions and types, and I think that from my experience, people's constitution, whether you want to look at it in terms of 5 elements, or as my training has been more in the Korean tradition, in terms of constitutional types, using imagery derived from the I Ching, from the Book of Changes, that's something that I think is actually a genetic predisposition that we inherit and will flavor what our range of possibilities is in life. But in addition to that, there is something in our spirit which, when we get that Jing from our parents that defines us genetically, then our spirit will say, oh, look at that. Here's a place I would like to reside. And it will lock on. And that's actually, in my point of view, the basic understanding of Shen disturbances, or of what this weekend should be about, which is the reason people have Shen disturbances is because something has happened to their Jing. And as we'll see, let's go to the next slide. What do the spirits of Shen do from Lung Shu 8? They lead the Qi, the breaths, and the breaths within me are not undifferentiated, they're individualized, and this aspect of individualization is called the essence. So the essences are necessary for the spirit to stay within us, and the spirit is necessary in order to lead our Qi in the direction that we want it to go. Next slide. So the Jing Shen and the mystery of life, the spirits impregnate the essences, creating life and giving it duration. And it's the strength of Shaoyin, because Shaoyin, the lower part is the Shaoyin includes the kidney and the heart. I don't have to go through the whole thing. But this is the reflection of the relation of the essences to the spirit. Life exists only through the joining and co-penetration of essence and spirit. Animation without form is as impossible as form without animation. And I talked yesterday about what is it like when the spirit leaves the body. So you can have a form without spirit, but essentially you're ending up with a dead body when you do that. So the implication here is our gametes from our parents obviously are a physical attribute of nature. You know, we can look at them under a microscope, we can see them. That's part of the earthly realm. The spirits, you never see the spirits. They're obviously part of the heavenly realm, this intangible thing. And it's only by the joining of the intangible with the tangible that we get completeness and health. Next slide. So, living beings come forth and emerge from their essences, and we'll see that the essences form a grouping that reunites the determining aspects of the species. So we're getting back to genetics here and or individuality, and this presides over identity or development of each person. And that's the point I made before about the CF, I think, being basically a genetic issue. Next. Now, Huainanza's very interesting statement here says, so the body wears out, but the spirits are not subject to transformation. Because they're not transformed, they resonate with all transformations. 1,000 changes and 10,000 twists and turns, and not even the beginning of their limit. I think what they're basically saying here is spirit is incorruptible, is perhaps never truly born and never truly dies. Maybe it's immortal. That spirit is in this realm of before manifestation, and so we can't really know exactly what's going on in that realm because it doesn't manifest. We only see the effects. We don't really ever see spirit. We see the effects of spirit. And the implication of this is that in a person's life, when they have what we call a spiritual problem, health problem, you know, they have a Shen disturbance, we call it a Shen disturbance because that's how we experience it. But actually, their Shen is not changed. Their Shen can't be corrupted. That's basically what Huainanza is saying. Shen never changes. It always is what it is. The problem is that in order for the human being to function, their Jing has to be proper. Their Jing has to be in a good, healthy state. If it's not, the Shen aren't happy. They don't stay with the Jing, and they don't do their job. They don't lead the Qi. That's the Shen's job, is to lead the Qi. And if the Jing is not available to house the Shen just are going to fly off and not be present, not do their job. There's nothing wrong with them. They're still fine. They're just not connected to the person. So we don't really ever even treat the Shen. What I'm saying is I think what we treat is the Jing, which again is a much more material aspect of the human being. And it's a lot easier to understand why we can treat Shen disturbances is because we can treat people's physical aspect. We can stick needles in, we can give them drugs, we can do lots of things that are materially effective. And by doing that, if we can just restore their essence to its proper situation, the Shen will come back and say, okay, good, great, this is where I wanted to be in the first place. And these people will be able to recover. Okay, next slide. So what I'm proposing is that possession is by definition a spirit level issue, but the spirit can only abide if the essence binds the spirit, and the spirit can never be damaged. So the problem when somebody's possessed is it must be something's wrong with the essence. And this is backed up by lots of classical Chinese medical dicta that say lots of warnings about not dissipating your essence. Don't indulge in too much sex. Don't overwork. You know, all of these things that talk about how you can injure your essence. by the way you conduct your life. They're not talking about how you can screw up your Shen. They're talking about how you can mess up your Jing. And when you do that, you're setting yourself up for a Shen disturbance. Okay, next one. If there's anything new here. Okay, so the essences have the possibility of repair as long as one still has life. And we repair the essences in two ways. There are two kinds, there are two kinds of essences. The essence of pre-heaven, which is governed and stored by the kidney, and the essence of post-heaven, which is stored and governed by the spleen. Okay, next slide. So where am I leading this to? Where am I leading this to? One of the problems I had with learning this protocol from Worsley was this idea that the external dragons always relate to some kind of thing from outside, and the internal dragons always relate to some kind of thing from an emotional upset. And in the cases I gave you, that was indeed reflective of what was going on with them. But if you once learn how to diagnose the situation through the pulse, and you don't have to do it that way, you can still stick with doing it through visual diagnosis of eye contact, whatever. What I think is really nice about doing it through pulse diagnosis is it tells you exactly, actually Worsley taught, here's the thing, you can't tell for sure whether you need the internal dragons or the external dragons to treat somebody who's possessed. So first, his recommendation was first treat them with the internal dragons, because that's more commonly the problem in his experience. Sedate the points. If that doesn't work, tonify them, take the needles out. If it still doesn't work, if they still look like they're possessed, put in the external dragons, sedate them, leave them a while. If that doesn't work, tonify them, take them out, and hopefully at that point you will have succeeded. If you haven't, you probably just missed the point, so you misdiagnosed them, one or the other. To me, that was always too wishy-washy. It was like I wanted something more specific. And I think that's what the pulse diagnostic method allows for, is it allows you to know which protocol to use, and if we have enough time to get to it, whether you should be tonifying or sedating the points. Okay? Also, it allows you to understand this in terms of classical Chinese medical theory. There are two kinds of essences, the inherited and acquired, right? And there are two kinds of demons, internal and external. There are two protocols, internal and external, and what do these deal with? We'll get to the points, but I'll tell you now, the internal demons deal with the points on the stomach meridian, essentially, and the external dragons deal with the points on the bladder meridian. Stomach meridian relates to the earth element. The bladder meridian relates to the water element. And as I showed you on the pulse pictures of these people who had Shen disturbances, the person who needed the bladder meridian treated for external demons had their pulses at the deepest water level, which is where they needed treatment, on the bladder meridian. Person who had their pulses in the middle level needed treatment on the stomach meridian, which is the earth element at the middle level. Okay, next slide. So we have some terms we need to look at. How much time do we have left?
30 minutes.
30 minutes, okay, so we can take our time.
So, we started 10 minutes later.
Okay, I don't think we need to rush. So these are the different terms that we want to talk about. The spirit, the essence, anterior and posterior heaven. So let's go to the next slide. Probably every talk you've been to these last 2 days talks about the Shen. So we all know what that's just a character for it. Next slide is, I like to use Riga a lot for looking at and understanding Chinese characters. So in this character, the thing that's being shown is the influence coming from heaven, from the sun, the moon, and the stars, that this is some kind of transcendent aspect that can be looked at maybe scientifically, because on one hand we can call it astrology, which is a kind of mystical way of looking at the influence of the heavens on human beings. Another way we could look at it is as an astronomical finding, that we know human beings have rhythms that are influenced by the heavenly bodies. You know, we have the woman's monthly cycle that's connected to the phases of the moon. We have all of our cycles that go with the seasons of the year that are connected to the Earth's relationship to the sun. We have the daily cycles that relate to the rotation of the Earth around its own axis with regard to the sun. Why is it unreasonable to think that these other very large structures in the universe don't also have some impact on human physiology? So I think that's what's being indicated in Shen, that there are things coming from the universe. We can't see them, we can't necessarily measure them, because they're coming in that realm of the unmanifested influences, but they're just as real, they're just as important. Okay, next slide. So the Shen has both every Chinese character has a radical and a phonetic. The phonetic component of Shen, which is what gives it its pronunciation, is showing here. One explanation of it is two hands extending a rope, indicating expansion, but then again, they also looked at it as a man standing with a belt girding himself, and there was another allusion here to the two primitive, expansion of the two primitive natural powers, which are what the two powers are. We can look at it as heaven and earth. We can look at it as yin and yang. That the idea behind Shen is very, very close to the essential organizing concepts in Oriental medicine, even in the structure of the character. Okay, next slide. So now we get to anterior and posterior essence, and these characters, so the essence has a character for the rice grain in it, which is a very material source of sustenance for us, so it's easy to understand the relationship to the earth element. And here what I wanted to point out is that the pure and clear essences are the template for each life. The essences of anterior heaven are received from the parents, and they form the basis for the maintenance of life and the continuation, which is supported by the essences we get from food and air, which are the posterior heaven essences. And actually, this is from Lauren Rochat, their translation. They actually use the term that I alluded to yesterday, Ganying, mutual resonance. By mutual resonance, the essences reach the internal organs, the zang, which they regenerate, and where they're doing their work. So they're the materials that are full of vitality that weave all living things together. Okay, next slide. So that's about Jing. There's the character for Jing. There's the rice grain, which is one of the central aspects of the character, and there's also a component that we find in the character for Qi, and it's alluding to nourishment and support. Next. So another component of the character for Jing is this part that is referring to cinnabar and forms together with the rest of the phonetic aspect of the character, the Chinese word for the color light green, or it's actually the vivifying color of life. The color of life would be the best way to explain it. And Vieger notes that there's a problem here in that it's made from the figure that means cinnabar, which is a mercury compound that the Taoist alchemists use for trying to reach immortality. And cinnabar is red, whereas this character actually means green. And for him, this was confusing here, saying that these two complementary colors, red and green, are confounded, and that somehow there was some mistake made in the evolution of this character. But actually, that's one of the things that's wonderful about being a Chinese medicine practitioner is, and I gave another example yesterday, is if you know Chinese medicine, some of these things are no longer confounding. What do we know about red and green? If we're talking about life, what's the emblem of life in a human being or an animal? Cut yourself, what comes out? Blood. Blood is red. Blood is the manifestation of life. When your blood is, when you're bloodless, you're lifeless. That's how we talk about, somebody who's lifeless. We say, they're blood. They look like they don't have any blood left. And what is the analog of blood in a plant? The sap, right? And what is the color for trees? What is the color of the plant kingdom? If the animal kingdom is symbolized by having blood that's red, plant kingdom is symbolized by its greenery. That's how we see that they're alive and vital. Same thing with people. We see that blush in their expression. We know that they're vital. So actually this red and green, it's just a way of saying that life is much bigger than just a person or just an animal, and I think by implication it's really much bigger than even just the plants. I talked about this yesterday. It includes the animal, the mineral kingdom as well. It's really talking about existence, that everything in existence has a life of some sort, and the physical aspect of that is manifested in their Jing. The non-physical aspect is manifested in their Sheng. Okay, next slide. So we have a before heaven and an after heaven Jing. And this is always a little confusing to people. It basically comes from the I Ching, and one of the things that you find is that in a lot of Chinese literature, there's an inversion that happens between how the human organism operates at a pre-heaven state from how it operates at a post-heaven state. And whether this refers to prior to conception or prior to birth is an open question. I haven't clarified for myself yet what that means. I'm at the moment predisposed to think of pre-heaven as our state when we're in utero, when we're being developed, and our nutrition, our supply is coming from our mother through the placenta. And the way our organs are being developed and function is actually different than the way they will function once we're born and have an independent existence. Regardless of that, the actual use for my presentation today is that there are two states of the essence. One is what we get from our parents that's guarded by the kidney, and it's gradually used up throughout our lifetime. And the second is the acquired essence that we produce from what we take in, food and drink, but also ideas, everything that nourishes us, makes essence. The essence is the most purified, refined aspect of what we take in. The bigger part goes to making zhengqi, the actual energy that we use every day in our lives. But the most pure aspect gets sent to the kidney and the spleen to help reinforce. It has to get templated so that it can replenish that little bit of inherited essence that we are continually using throughout our life. Otherwise, if we have sex 10 times and then we're dead, we've used up all our essence. That's not going to work. We need some mechanism to be able to replenish what we have a limited supply of. And so this acquired essence, for the most part, can do that pretty well. Not perfectly, otherwise we'd live forever. At some point we're going to run out of the ability to be completely faithful to the original essence, the inherited essence in what we can produce. But if we live as the texts instruct us, not a dissipated lifestyle, then we will protect our essence as much as possible and live as long as possible in a healthy state. Okay, next. Okay, spirits are the essences, breaths, the jingqi of the liquids and grains. They're rooted in anterior heaven, whereas the essences of liquids and cereals are rooted in posterior heaven. And that as soon as we have the essences, now we have the spirits. Okay, next slide. So I think I've made this point, I'm being redundant here, but just to point it out again, that the anterior heaven relates to the kidneys, which are of the water element. And as Elizabeth spoke about yesterday, the spirit of the water element is the will, or the zhi, which is the spirit of water. And the posterior heaven relates to the earth element, and its spirit is a yi, and that's the intent here. Another aspect of the spirit. And what was the thing? So what would it look like if somebody lost control of either their will, in the sense, the Chinese sense of the term, or their intention, which is the yi, right? The earth spirit? If somebody lost that. So we can try to think about what Elizabeth was talking about yesterday, that our intention is our basic idea of where we want to go in our lives, and the will is what gives us the push to be able to continue to manifest that. So let's look at the next slide. And think about what a person who's possessed would look like. So possession is a spirit level abnormality where some aspect of the person's spirit has relinquished full control over their life. Okay, they no longer are living out who they really are. Which is the same thing that I started with saying with that hook, right? Somebody's got a hook that's limiting their ability to be themselves fully. This can only happen if the essences aren't full, because as I said, the spirits are incorruptible. Nothing changes with the spirit, which is the same way, I think we all know this, that who we are, we have a sense of continuity. When you're 5 years old, you have some sense of, I'm, whatever your name is, that's who I am. And when you're 80 years old, you still say the same thing about yourself. I'm that same person. Yeah, I've changed a lot, but it's still me. That me that goes throughout your whole life never changes. That's your spirit. It's who you are. But there are lots of other things that do change over time, and that relates to your essence, which plays out in those cycles of 7 and 8 years, depending on whether you're a man or a woman. You know, we all have limits to how long we can expect to live with the essences that we've been endowed with. So what role does the heart play in all of this? And we talked about yesterday and a little bit today, the heart should be empty like heaven itself. And if your emotions are not controlled, your heart is not going to be empty. So when you're in the treatment room or when you're dealing with other people in your daily life, if you can keep your emotions under control so that they're not predisposing you to see somebody else in a certain way, but just be open to what are they actually bringing to you, then you'll be able to give an authentic response. If you already have your heart preoccupied, then you're not going to be able to do that. You're going to be prejudiced already in terms of your response. Next slide. So what do pathologies of anterior heaven and posterior heaven look like? I don't think there's another part to this. So possession is a controversial diagnosis, but common treatment diagnostically based on looking in the eyes. Chaos on the pulses was another term. So Worsley did actually talk about the pulses in terms of diagnosing possession, but the only way he explained it was the pulses made no sense, that they were chaotic. My experience is they're not chaotic at all. They're actually just have adopted a very abnormal state that is indicating the essences are asking for help. But the other question we're going to have to ask ourselves is, which element do we go for if we think somebody's possessed? So this, again, is just my own personal experience, is people who have problems with anterior heaven essence, so that's the kidney side of our essences. If they have problems with that, they tend to be somewhat sluggish in their thoughts. They complain about brain fog, lack of marrow, and therefore what we usually need to do is tonify the points of the dragon's treatment. Those are the external dragons on the bladder meridian, whereas, and I talked yesterday about yellow and black. This relates to heaven. So heaven and water are black, and the color of the bladder meridian is black. Whereas the people who are suffering from acquired essence problems need the internal dragons, and they tend to be people who are very talkative, obsessive. They're the people who read in the classics, stand up on the table and take their shirt off and start singing and things like that. And those are classic Shen disturbances. Next slide. Okay, so and just to make sure we get through enough of this, let's go through the next slide. I want to go through the points so you know what the treatments entail. These are the external dragons. First point, there are 7 points for each of these protocols. The external dragons have one master point, which is governing vessel 20, the 100 convergences, but it's also a sea of marrow, which relates to the marrow is governed by the kidney. Sea of essence, also called the sea of essence. Marrow and essence are very closely related concepts. The 100 meetings relate to the ancestors, which for me is reflecting inherited. The ancestors are what we inherit, so inherited essence, again relating to the water element. And its secondary name, so you know all the meridian points have both a primary name, but also a secondary name, which in this case is Ghost Gate. And again, we're going to find this word ghost coming up in many of the points that are used in the dragon protocols, because these were described as ghost illnesses. Okay, possession. Next slide. Next point is bladder 11, great shuttle, whose secondary name is 100 exhaustions, echoing the 100 meetings of GV20. And it's also a point of the Sea of Bone, which is under the control of the kidney, and so nicely fits into that category. Next one is bladder 23, which obviously is kidney related. It's the kidney associated shoe point, and its secondary name is essence palace. So it's here very, very clearly talking about the S at this point treats the essences. It's interesting. There are, I'm not going to, it's going to take me too far apart. Okay, next point. And then the last point, so each of these points are bilateral. So bladder 11, bladder 23, and bladder 61 are bilateral, left and right. There's lots of translations. I think Worsley calls it servant assisting, subservient visitor, servant reporting. But it has a secondary name of pacifying devils on shit. So there are reasons why these points have been used in this protocol for treating Shen disturbances. And they're all points on the bladder meridian which explain why the pulse manifestation is at the deepest level of the yang position when you take the pulses. Okay, next slide. Okay, the internal dragons here are, again, as we're going to see, relating more to the acquired essence rather than the inherited. So the bladder 23 relates to the inherited essence. Now we want to talk about the acquired essence, where it has to do with the digestive system being able to create more and more purified energy to support the kidney's inherited essence. Okay, next slide. The master point here is conception vessel 15, turtle dovetail, but its secondary names are spirit palace, spirit storehouse, and actually in the Ling Shu, it's talked about as being the source point of the Gao and the meeting point of the Huang. And if you remember, Gao Huang, that's the name for the outer point at the level of the fourth thoracic vertebrae, which is talked about as, I think Worsley translates it as the vitals, treating the vitals, and vitality or vitals is just a pure translation of the Chinese word for essence, of Jing. So again, this is relating directly to Jing, and physically its location actually is pretty much, if you go down from, if you stick a needle in CV15 deep enough, you're probably going to penetrate the stomach. And as you'll see, the rest of the points for the internal dragons are on the stomach meridian. And the indications for CV15 are include hysteria, jumping up and down, incoherent speech, mad walking and talking and singing and stuff like that. Classical Shen disturbance. Next slide. Stomach 25 bilaterally is the next point, which is celestial pivot, but its secondary name is repairing the source, Wu Yuan. The sources are the original energy that goes to each of the points, goes to each of the organs, and has to come from the essence that those organs store. They transmute the essence into energy, and that gets sent to the different organs. It's also called the doorway of the Po, which is it's the lung spiritual faculty, and its functions are regulating the stomach and spleen, and lots of digestive symptomatology. But celestial pivot, anytime you see the word celestial, it automatically means that you have to be thinking about heaven, the heavens, and that this may have an impact on the spirit level. Next slide is stomach 32, a point that I think is not very much used in TCM acupuncture, but very much in Worsley style acupuncture, crouching rabbit. So this is a reunion point for the veins for blood, which is close to nutrition, close to blood, and yin qi are very close concepts, whereas wei qi is very much close to, as defensive energy, to the idea of protection from the external stuff. This is the internal stuff, the nourishment, the blood. Indications include ghost talk and possessed by devils. This was from Kespi's textbook in French, but also some digestive, abdominal distension, digestive symptoms, and it's on the stomach meridian. Next point, slide, is stomach 41 bilaterally, released stream or gully stream divide, and it has both mental, spiritual, and digestive indications. And if you looked at all of these indications, most of them sound like excess kinds of situations. As I said before, people let's jump up on tables and singing and shouting and tearing their clothes off. They're, too much heat and excess. So usually when you're treating the stomach meridian for the internal dragons, you want to sedate, which is a good rule of thumb. In advanced pulse diagnosis, which unfortunately I'm not going to have time to get into today, there are ways of, by using Ayurvedic pulses, I believe there are ways of knowing beforehand whether you need to tonify and sedate. So my recommendation here is with the internal dragons on the stomach meridian, you're much safer first sedating because usually the presentation is an excess one. With the external dragons, usually you'll want to tonify. Interestingly, the case I gave you of somebody with external dragons that I treated, I tonified those points in a woman who was, by all appearances, agitated and talking a lot and everything like that, that looks like an excess that you would want to disperse or sedate. But because of what I felt in her pulse, by the Ayurvedic pulse diagnosis, I thought her bladder meridian was deficient. And because the points for the external dragons are on the bladder meridian, I tonified those points rather than dispersed it, and that's what worked for her. So there's a lot more to learn about this stuff. I can only introduce you to it, but how much time do you have? Okay, so I'll entertain a question or two, but that's basically, I think, where we should end today's presentation.
Thank you for its revelation.
Okay. Oh, you're welcome. I hope it wasn't too obscure for everybody.
Peter, I have a question.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, when you were doing the levels on the pulse diagnosis,
Yes.
I noticed that, I may be totally wrong, that on one of the indications, they were all at the bottom,
Yes.
and on one of them, they were sort of halfway up. Is there some sort of meaning for where you would find them? This is when they had the possession, you saw that they were all the same, but is there any meaning for where you see them the same? Like,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, if they're all in the middle level, that middle level is the earth level corresponding to the spleen and stomach.
Okay.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that means they have a problem with the required essence. If they're all at the deepest level, that's the water level, corresponding to kidney and bladder, and it means they have a problem with their inherited essence.
Okay, great, thanks.
Anything else?
Do you ever leave anybody just pull it tight or?
Yeah, good question. The question is, do I leave needles in ever, or do I just tonify them with a quick needle technique? No, in treating the internal dragons, I said, usually I end up sedating the points, and I do that by leaving the needles in. Yeah, usually for around 20 or 30 minutes.
Because in some traditions they actually leave the needles in when they tonify.
Yes. Yes, my experience is that if you use the needle technique that Worsley teaches, it's effective. Doesn't mean that other needle techniques are ineffective, but it works to do it that way. And since that's my training, I tend to follow that. But I've left needles in when I want to tonify, particularly if when I've worked with that person and I've done a treatment and I don't feel the pulse change that I expect to feel, I may go back and say, okay, next time I treat them, or the next point I do with them, let me see what happens if I leave the needles in. And it is the case that sometimes leaving the needle in leads to a better tonification. Yeah.
Very quick question. Did you notice how long does the treatment effect last after the syndrome?
Good question. So with that first case presentation I gave to you with the woman who was suicidal, she needed to have that treatment repeated about 2 or 3 times within the first month that I saw her, because she was in crisis with certain things in her life, and it kept coming back, pulse picture kept coming back. But after I had done it 2 or 3 times, she went years without needing to have it done again. So it's variable. Again, all of these findings depend on what's going on in a person's life and how are they deciding to make changes. Acupuncture doesn't make people's lives work. People make their lives work. We just give them the possibility of changing something that's not working for them. So if they make a healthy change, one treatment may be enough to last forever. If they need a little more help and they aren't there yet, we may have to repeat it. Okay, thank you again.